I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we're joined by a first-time guest, the Quincy Institute's Karthik Sankaran. He works at the Quincy Institute as an expert on geoeconomics, and he'll be joining us on this edition of the show to discuss Trump's tariffs. That's been in the news a lot lately, and we're going to get Karthik's take. He describes himself as a neoliberal peacenik. Now, I know a number of my listeners are going to shut down after hearing that because a number of my listeners are very critical of neoliberalism. I myself have been critical of neoliberalism, but I do think Karthik is worth listening to, whether you agree or disagree with him, and I think there's a lot to be said about these tariffs. They've been criticized by everyone from neoliberal centrists to right-wing libertarians like Thomas Sowell to even progressively minded protectionists. So there's been criticism from across the political spectrum, and we're going to talk about what these tariffs mean, especially for international relations. What does it mean for the global south? What does it mean for Mexico, China, Europe, and the EU? All that and more on this edition of Parallax Views. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation. Welcome to Parallax Views, a first-time guest that I'm very happy to have on. Karthik Sankaran is a senior research fellow in geoeconomics in the Global South program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He originally trained as a modern European historian and then pursued a career in journalism and then as a strategist in finance. And we're going to be talking about Trump's tariffs. First off, how are you doing?
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me here, Vijay.
If you could, I guess where we should start is, what do you see as the impetus behind Trump's tariffs? I see a lot of people saying there's no method to this. This is all madness. But, is there a logic to it?
There is a logic to this. And, I think there's a logic. The problem is that there are too many of them and that they are not necessarily mutually consistent is how I would phrase it. So if you think about it in terms of rationales, one thing that we know about Trump in particular is that he has long hated trade deficits. Going back to the 1980s, he was complaining about Japan, and in some ways, his complaints about Japan have been transposed onto China and the EU and other countries right now. The second thing is that this comes in the middle of a very big shift in American domestic politics that we saw in 2016 with his election. But arguably even before that, and I think the key moment there was Hillary Clinton announcing that she was going to pull out of TPP, which is just an indication of how globalization, particularly the globalization of manufacturing supply chains, had become a deeply contested issue in American politics, and particularly in what is not only kind of the old industrial heartland of the upper Midwest and Western Pennsylvania, but also the fulcrum of American domestic politics, given the way, the electoral college works. So, he was, so kind of reversing that process of the globalization of supply chains was certainly something that, that resonated. So that's one aim for the tariffs. Another aim for the tariffs, stated aim, is just to get more revenues. A third one is the idea that the U.S. had become too closely intertwined with China, which presented not just a threat in terms of economics, the economic issues laid out before, but also in terms of national security, and that became even more pronounced after COVID, when we were getting a huge bunch of our, protective equipment from China and so on. And the final part of this is that the idea that the U.S. is the world's largest marketplace, access to it is a privilege, a term that you keep using that you keep here being used frequently, and that this privilege should be kind of tiered according to a country's conformity with either certain economic goals or political goals or geopolitical goals of the U.S. So you end up with this idea of tiered tariffs. Now, all of these things together are, so it's not even so much that there is no method. I would argue that there are too many methods here, and a lot of them contradict each other. First of all, in terms of tools, secondly, in terms of effects, but also critically in terms of domestic constituencies. Because if one of the goals of tariffs is to force other countries to lower their tariffs, that helps one set of people in the United States. That helps those sectors of the American economy that would do very well if you opened up areas outside the United States more to American business. So that's finance, maybe aerospace, agriculture, kind of places where the U.S. is at the leading edge. If the goal of tariffs is actually to stay in place forever and grow a homegrown industry behind it that is protected from the deleterious effect of foreign competition, then that's a different constituency. That's steel workers, for example. Over and above that, there's the question of whether you want to tariff everybody or whether you only want to tariff adversaries, whether you want to reverse NAFTA or kind of make a fortress North America as a more economically consistent whole. So there are just too many different constituencies and tools and goals. So that's where the not even so much madness, but the problems arise.
That's actually a good lead in where I want to go next. And we're going to get later into the effects this is going to have on the global South and also U.S. foreign policy and international relations more generally. But one thing I've noticed is that the striking response to these tariffs, the criticism hasn't just come from maybe centrists of a neoliberal sort of ideological persuasion, but also even across the ideological spectrum. I saw Thomas Sowell, the libertarian right winger, very critical of these tariffs. Even a progressive protectionist like Lori Wallach from Rethinking Trade at the Economic Liberties Project, who I would place on the left, has been critical. Why is there sort of this response from various different, seemingly ideologically opposed viewpoints converging in their criticism of Trump on this?
I mean, the criticisms from the from the traditionally pro-trade constituencies, those make sense. And that, I think of Scott Lincecum at Cato, for instance, who has been writing about this for a long time. And I myself describe myself in social media as a neoliberal peacenik. So I kind of, and the peacenik part is what brought me to QI. But anyway, So that's one set. That's one set of responses. The other set of responses, perhaps from portions of of the left, I think may proceed from two different places. One is the view that these are just too large and too scattershot, and they will have a bad impact on the U.S. economy in and of itself. And a very clear example of this is what might end up happening with the U.S. automobile industry, which is now consists of deeply intertwined continental supply chains. And the worry is, on in some portions, is that, and Mexico and Canada were exempted from the latest round of tariffs, but they got hit by automobile tariffs earlier, with some carve outs that recognize the fact that, you know, things like 40% of all auto parts come from Mexico. So if you impose tariffs on that and you interrupt those supply chains, you end up with a problem. We've already seen furloughs as a result of that. So one set of complaints, of concerns about from the left, I think, comes in the context of a belief that these are too large, and as I said, they are too scattershot. And USMCA is an interesting example here because I've seen various people suggest, like at the Roosevelt Institute, for instance, that USMCA is actually a good model for all trade because what it has done is it has imposed restrictions on rules of origin based on a minimum wage. $16, 40% of all 40 to 45% of all content has to come from workers making $16 an hour, which is something we don't have outside. In other trade agreements, there's a rapid response mechanism, which is basically allows the U.S. to essentially stop imports from facilities that don't conform with certain things like allowing unions and so on. So there's a sense that, you know, we have introduced this architecture that is favorable to workers both in the United States and overseas, and that's an architecture that should be extended. So that, I think, is one set of criticism from that portion of the spectrum. The other one, and I'm kind of closer to this part, is just the broader impact on the global South and what it does for development paths in very poor countries. And here, you know, the fact that countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh are being hit with tariffs close to 50%, strikes some people, and I would argue, I would put myself in that category, as deeply problematic in the sense that it essentially takes away a ladder that is enormously beneficial outside the U.S. and has, and the impact within the U.S. could be of such things could be countered by other means. It was not, but it could be. So that's where I would see that side, that side coming from.
So, in terms of the effect on the global South, I want you to delve into that more because I think a lot of people are thinking, well, what does this mean for inflation in the U.S.? But I think the global South may be being neglected when it comes to the discussion, at least in American media, in some ways right now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think here, um, the issue is exactly what I mentioned earlier. It's kind of taking away a ladder. Now, you mentioned at the beginning that I was that I'm in finance, and in fact, I was involved with I was first an analyst, then a trader in what are called in emerging markets currencies and emerging markets fixed income. It's something I've now come to return the global South with my new responsibilities, but essentially, they're not that different, except that China was considered an emerging market, but China is not really a part of the global South. But anyway, I started doing that in 1997. I was a journalist before that, writing for a paper called Emerging Markets. Before then, for a few years, and this is something that Branko Milanovic, in his has written a lot about in his Elephant Crafter. What we've seen in the last 30 years, in this second great phase of globalization, the first one being 1870 to 1914, the second one that began in 1990, was a dramatic reduction in intercountry inequality, in the sense that you got a very rapid rise in incomes in portions of the global south, primarily in 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 China, Southeast Asia, and in parts of India, since those economies opened up to the world. And there was a hiccup, obviously, in 1997, 98 with the Asian financial crisis, but that process has continued. And by overwhelming consensus, that improvement is located in the their involvement with global manufacturing supply chains at increasingly uh, at increasing levels of technological complexity, right? So you have these offshore factories, and what they do is it's not just that they're employing labor there; they're also transmitting technological and managerial know-how that then diffuses outward into the system, allows for development. So I think that is one intrinsic good. The other thing I've noticed that, and this is kind of more of a finance nerd thing, is that it's also led to increased financial resilience in those countries, in the sense that if you go back, maybe 40, 50 years, if you go back to the Latin American debt crisis, the 1980s, for instance, those were countries that were predominantly commodity exporters. Uh, when they borrowed overseas, they borrowed in dollars. Then the Volcker shock hit, and the dollar went up, commodity prices went down. They found themselves owing much more money than they could repay, got stuck in this vicious political and economic and financial cycle, which in many ways has persisted, in parts of the Andes, it's persisted for 40 years. In Argentina, it's persisted. There's this endless cycle and I think that's definitely, from my point of view as a former uh, emerging markets analyst, that has been a path that has been deeply, deeply problematic. Whereas what we're seeing, this new development path through integration manufacturing supply chains, has not just increased complexity, it's also increased financial resilience, in the sense that what you have is you have a more diversified export mix, and you have an export mix that's able to respond quite quickly when your currency weakens. And because it's easier to ship, you have a wider variety of things that become competitive in global markets when your currency weakens. So I think this has been positive. One of the things with these tariffs and the broader attempt linked with the tariffs is to curtail these beneficial impacts, or indeed to reverse them. And it's also happening at a time when this process, from my point of view, the problem with this process that I described earlier of the globalization of supply chains, was not that it happened, but that it did not happen sufficiently. It did not happen in parts of the world like Africa, portions of portions of South America. And what I'm saying here is, if you go back kind of a year, this was kind of the consensus across much of the development literature. How do we get Kenya to be able to do what these countries in Southeast Asia have done? So that's where I see a kind of a pretty big issue with not just with the tariffs, but the broader strategy, but the broader goals here.
I hope this isn't an odd question. But I think for many people, the sort of economically interdependent world we've been living in, that economic interdependence can be seen as a sort of peacekeeping force by some. It promotes the idea, well, we have to trade with people. It sort of incentivizes peaceful relations. With these tariffs, could we be moving into a sort of new era of fragmentation and sort of controlled decoupling, could this lead to conflict?
I don't know if it would lead to conflict per se. As I said, I describe myself as a neoliberal peacenik, so I do believe in kind of the beneficial impact of commerce. This is a theory that goes back, 400 or so years. At least Montesquieu before. It's the sweet commerce, do commerce. Because I'm a dad joke guy, I like to say commerce, just do it. Maybe I'll have T-shirts printed up that say that someday. But anyway, this is just something that the that has been enormously beneficial. And if we reverse it, there is a danger that the moderating impact of people involved in these interconnections dissipates, right? That you have, but one of the things about commerce is precisely that it, in my view at least, that it enables kind of, they may not be people to people contacts, but they're business to business contacts. And one of the ways I've described this is, this goes back to the story of the different constituencies. I describe a group of people in the United States as openers, those who want to use tariffs in order to open other markets to the U.S. And I think the more interconnection there is along those lines, the more likely it becomes that you have a constituency that does not want to see those disrupted, whether through tariffs or whether in a more extreme way through war. And this is an idea that also goes back to Karl Polanyi in The Great Transformation, when he talks about the international finance in that 1870 to 1914 area being deeply intertwined and present in every single one of the combatants. In every single one of the European combatants before 1914, and that was the International Peace Party. So I do believe in that concept. As to whether countries react to this forced decoupling in a more belligerent way right now, I don't think that's an immediate danger. Just because there is what seems to be happening, at least, is an effort outside the U.S. to have other lines of communication open that may not necessarily include the U.S. So, for instance, you have the EU and China may be talking. I don't know what's going to happen. There is a parallel process developing inside the World Trade Organization of a binding arbitration protocol called the MPIA, which allows people to engage in trade disputes and actually come up with a solution in a way that is feasible, because it's kind of opt-in, and once you're in, it's binding. It kind of deals with the fact that the U.S. essentially disabled the premier, the WTO's equivalent of a Supreme Court when they blew up the appellate body. So I'm hopeful that there are other methods that persist that do not lead to belligerence as a consequence of this. But that's mostly because places outside the U.S. are still engaging in their own bilateral and multilateral frameworks.
I mean, I know this is going to be a sort of overly simplistic question, but I think the question on a lot of people's minds are which countries, which nation states are the biggest sort of winners and losers with this tariff regime being put into place?
I mean, I mean, as for losers, my biggest concern really is the poorest countries in the global south, because that, if this sticks, that takes away something, a a tried and tested development mechanism from them, and it may come alongside uh, other happenings that are happen, other things that are happening on the international development front. What's happening with what's happening with the USAID and so on. There may be multiple things happening at the same time that act to constrict uh, development opportunities. Now, perhaps some of those can be reconstituted if framed in a context of great power competition. That maybe the U.S. will reinstate some of those mechanisms for countries that are seen as critical. Other other winners, oddly enough, are there are large parts of South America that might do okay.
I was going to say, I think you say in your article at Responsible Statecraft that Brazil actually might benefit depending on their next actions.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of countries that, and it's interesting. This goes back to the issue of the tariffs, not completely, but particularly hitting those countries that have started this path of um, moving up the path of export-led manufacturing supply chains, and those are the countries that are kind of right that are right in the target zone. South America, has by and large not gotten there. Its export mix is much more commodity dependent, and they import enough from the U.S. that they ended up with a 10% tariff. And places like Brazil and Argentina will probably end up as beneficiaries from the Chinese retaliatory tariffs. And so if what ends up happening is that it's not going to make American farmers very happy, but I think there's very little likelihood that China just buys more agricultural goods from Brazil and Argentina, for instance. So they should come out well. Mexico is a very interesting case because depending on where that line is drawn between the idea that we need to kind of nearshore in order to have supply chain resilience, that is, bring those supply chains back certainly from China, maybe from other parts of Southeast Asia, maybe even India, which has been hit by a pretty high tariff. So that's one argument. That's the nearshoring or friendshoring argument. The other argument is actually everything needs to be in America. So depending on where the politics of that fall, Mexico could be a beneficiary, and kind of reading between the lines, it seems as though there are different constituencies. The UAW, I think, feels quite strongly that we need a full repatriation of all those plants that were sent to Mexico after NAFTA. The U.S. auto industry, in particular, would face some pretty difficult economics were that to happen. There's a difference here between U.S. automakers and many foreign automakers, such as the Europeans and the Koreans, who use Mexico more as a final assembly point, to a much greater degree. So Mexico could come out okay. And the big question here is kind of more a diplomatic one. Kind of where diplomacy intersects with economics. And here's where I think it makes sense to look at the two other large chunks of the global economy. One is the EU, and the other obviously is China. And China is the second largest economy in the world. The EU as a unit is number three. Now, the EU is very interesting because what you've seen set in motion because of the changed security relationship with the United States, or the worry about a potentially changed security relationship with the United States, is a significant increase in projected defense spending, coming mostly out of Germany. Now, the peacenik part of me has some reservations about this, but I think if one accepts that, you know, the overwhelming message from Washington to the other side of the Atlantic is that you are not a primary priority. You need to do more for yourself. And then that means what you probably do need in the European case is an autonomous capacity for deterrence that does not depend on the United States, and an autonomous capacity for diplomacy as well, because you can't just do deterrence without doing diplomacy. So, you know, I hope one gets there. But what that does do, it does a couple of things in my view. One is that it potentially creates a macroeconomic offset to the loss of exports to the United States, just because the Germans have just announced a very large sum of money for that purpose. Ideally, a good chunk of it will also go to building infrastructure, climate resilience, many other things. I think the second point here is that, you know, as a currency person, I've been watching the EU for, you know, about 30 years now, wondering what was going, you know, what was going to happen to it. And this iteration is something else that makes me personally optimistic about the survival of the EU and the euro, because I see, you know, my view is I see, you know, people talk about Hamilton, about how Europe needs its Hamilton moment. Uh, um, I think they've actually seen a succession of Franklin moments, which is the idea that unless we hang together, we will hang separately. And this is the latest iteration of that, which potentially means, you know, first of all, the spending from Germany will have economic spillovers into other parts of the EU, just because the way supply chains work over there. It also, I think, increases to some degree the odds of joint and several debt issuance. Certainly, the ECB will be involved, just as it was during the pandemic, in protecting European bond markets from any untoward things happening because of the spending. So I think, you know, that's a place where, oddly enough, you might actually be ending up with something favorable, because if the goal is to force surplus countries to reduce their surplus by doing more to spend on other things instead of directing their industrial and financial and economic energies towards exports, Europe has been put in that position. The other one in this regard is China, obviously, and there some of the signs are preliminary, and it's you know, I'm not a China expert, but it does seem as though there does seem to be a somewhat greater focus on making the economy more resilient to tariffs by finally getting the central government to spend more money on encouraging consumption by Chinese citizens, improving the safety net, you know, giving subsidies, and so on. So, you know, in Europe, it's been clearer, just because the security impact and the economic impact intersect, and you've had a big announcement starting with what Friedrich Merz did with the old parliament, which is kind of which has some issues. But anyway, you kind of got an economic outcome. In China, you may be getting that. So I think more broadly, and this is kind of more of a markets-based viewpoint. If we do end up in a world where these tariffs do have a negative economic impact on the United States itself, which people seem to worry about. There's a pretty business sentiment has fallen. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty, and one of the implications of that, you've seen the stock market. You've also seen, and this, you know, you've had crazy movements in the market. But if what you end up with is a somewhat weaker dollar versus major currencies and lower interest rates in the US, that helps that may end up helping those large economies that are not as dependent on exports to the US to grow their economies, but do have an impact in terms of their financial conditions, in terms of their interest rates and currencies and what those things are doing, based on what's happening with the dollar and what's happening with US interest rates. So there are potential winner scenarios there as well. And the jargon term for this, if you have low real exposure to the United States, you don't export that much to them, but you have high financial exposure to them in the sense that you don't want your interest rates going up. You don't want the dollar to rally because you owe a lot of money in dollars, or because your businesses will send money over, or something like that. A world in which this tariff situation ends up being perceived as not that great for the US economy, you might be okay.
Just a few more questions here. I think the nature of these tariffs were really shocking to a lot of people because they're so sweeping. Like you said, I think some criticism from the left has been that, oh, it would have been better to do like targeted tariffs. But these are very sweeping tariffs. But at the same time, I do want to note, I think there's been a turn towards economic protectionism in the US, even under Biden. I mean, Biden blocked
No
the
question.
well, yeah, I was going to say I'm from Pittsburgh, so I know Biden blocked the sale of the uh, Pittsburgh-based U.S. steel company, which was going to be bought by a Japanese company. He blocked it, and I think that's indicative that we were moving towards more economic protectionism, even under Biden. What do you think? What are we to make of this bigger turn that has been happening both during the first Trump into the second Biden into the Biden administration, now into the second Trump administration?
That's probably, that's probably structural, I think, and just, and I would argue it goes back even before it go. For me, the moment of that is actually kind of long. This happened in October 2015, long even before Trump's surprising run in the GOP primaries in 2016. For me, the moment of this is Hillary Clinton deciding she was no longer going to support TPP, having championed it as Secretary of State. And I think that was just reading the tea leaves, reading the polling, however you want to phrase it. I think that's a structural story. You know, uh, so don't I don't think that is necessarily. I don't think that's going to be. I don't think that's going to be reversed. And in some ways, maybe some of the beneficial impacts of this will be seen. First of all, we need to, um, calibrate whatever we're doing in terms of domestic economic policy, uh, depending on the intersection of politics and goals, and depending on different constituencies, what different constituencies want. As I said, and that's frankly hard to do because even within the ranks of American workers. One point I would like to make is that for all that we focus on trade, the U.S. is a relatively closed economy. It is the most closed economy of the big three in terms of both imports and exports. So, as a natural byproduct of that is that that portion of the American working class engaged with trade per se is probably smaller than anywhere else. Our largest, and that's an aside, but just worth keeping in mind when you hear these sweeping pronouncements about the American working class. The American working class is mostly in services. uh, be that as it may, but I think, and the domestic politics here are also interesting because one argument that I would make is that what we have seen actually is, people want many things all at once, and depending on, and there are different degrees of political salience. But one thing we do know, or I think we know at least, is that people really dislike inflation that comes from supply chain interruptions. That was true in the 1970s. It was true during the pandemic, and it may be clear right now, which is one reason you have people like Ted Cruz worrying so much about what's going to happen in the midterms. If you get a broad-based inflationary outcome that results from the disruption of supply chains. So I think ultimately, from the point of the US, we probably are in a place where we have reached, um, you know, peak globalization, and there is going to be some pullback. The question is how we're going to calibrate it, depending on the different domestic constituencies. The potentially good news is that outside the U.S., you might be seeing what Scott Bessent wanted or claimed he wanted, which is an increase in other countries doing things that make up for the U.S. being kind of the consumer of last resort. So maybe those countries and the EU and China are critical in that respect, are doing what's needed to rely less on exports to the United States. And once those things get through, maybe we can get back to thinking about how to help the global South continue to benefit from the processes that have been, I regard as not without, you know, not without issue, but certainly largely beneficial in portions of the world, primarily in Asia, and also Central and Eastern Europe. But that's that's a different story. It wasn't this poor to begin with, and extend those processes into parts of Latin America and particularly Africa.
Last thing I wanted to delve into with you, I know you sort of describe yourself as a neoliberal peacenik, and I know I will have a portion of the audience, and it's probably maybe 60 to 70% of the audience is very critical of neoliberalism. Sometimes I think that there's legitimate criticisms of neoliberalism. I also think that people will confuse neoliberalism with libertarianism, and they're two different things. But
Yeah.
what do you want to say to my audience that may be unfairly shutting down when you say that you have neoliberal beliefs?
Well, I mean, maybe I can just give a description of what I think neoliberalism is. That differentiates it from three different uh, ideologies. And the way I have, let me see if I can remember. This is in one of my blog posts, um, uh, and some you know, and some portion of this is will still will still be triggering. So I'll say that neoliberalism is the belief that markets should be a central mode of allocation, that markets should be encased within public systems of regulation and adjudication. And finally, that those systems of regulation and adjudication should operate at a level that transcends the single nation state. So what that means is that the first part, that markets are a central allocative force, differentiates it from socialism. The encasement and regulation and adjudication differentiates it from libertarianism, a public, and the the idea that those mechanisms of public regulation and adjudication should be transnational or supranational is what differentiates it from classic 19th century national liberalism, the 1870 to 1914 period, whether it's Bismarck or McKinley or whoever. So that's my that. So I hope that at least disentangles it from some of the other things that people might dislike. I don't know if that
Any
works.
No, that's fine. Anything you want to say in closing? What do you think the most important points are people have to understand about these tariffs, and what do you want my listeners to get out of this conversation?
Um, well, I mean, just given where I stand, I would like them to think of trade as good. So trade is, trade is bad. No, the famous that famous notation. Trade is good, actually. Trade is good, comma, actually would be one thing, and the other it would be to just think about, when you think through this process, think about what I described. May be helpful analytically to think about different tools, different goals, and different constituencies. If you're thinking about it analytically, and just try to see how this all fits together and see what forms of coherence might emerge from this. And that could be useful even if you don't agree with me on anything.
There's one more thing, if I could throw this here at the end, and I know we're running a little bit long, but you wrote this article where you mentioned that you think the big risk of post neoliberalism is that it will not only just throw out the baby, but may even end up keeping the bathwater. You wrote that in an article in Substack for Most Favored Nations. What did you mean by that? I'm just curious if you could elaborate if you have the time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've described a great many things that I think are that are favorable. There are two things that I find uh, problematic. One is the extent to which um, there's kind there's a there's been an expansion of global supply chains in ways that I think are beneficial. But the other thing this has enabled is basically this tax arbitrage. So, for instance, the fact that um, a large number of American technology companies ship their intellectual property to a subsidiary in Ireland or Luxembourg or somewhere, and there's no manufacturing happening there or anything. It's just that your you basically pay royalties to your IP subsidiary located in a low tax location, and that is something that Brad Setzer, who your followers might know, written a lot about this, and I'm deeply sympathetic. So that's one of the pieces of the bathwater that we may end up keeping, precisely because there's because the constituency of forces is such that, well, we clamp down on wages on imports from countries that are poorer, but the constituency that wants tax arbitrage is much larger. So that's one part of it. I think another one is that, to my mind at least, one of the reasons that trade is such a fractious issue in American politics is that there is very little bipartisan agreement on how to fix, or even if to fix, some of the most problematic issues in American life, in American economics that affect a far larger number of people. I think that things like the cost of healthcare, things like housing, where you have not just bipartisan but intra-party disagreements between YIMBYs and NIMBYs, the cost of the cost of higher education, what kind of the issues for low wage service workers. There are a large number of things in the American economy that to my mind at least, affect a larger number of people than trade. And the absence of an agreement, both within and across parties, about what to do about these things, leads it to be many anxieties, justifiable anxieties, to be displaced onto trade, I think. And that's what I mean by throwing out the baby, keeping the bathwater.
Well, hey, I want to thank you again, Karthik, for coming on Parallax Views. Very much appreciate it. And people can keep up with your work, I assume, at Responsible Statecraft and the Quincy Institute. And you're also on X as well?
Yes, I am. Yeah, as Raja Corman, which is actually a 40-year-old joke about how I was going to return to India someday and make a career as a B movie director.
I like that reference because I'm a big Roger Corman fan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views. To Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.